Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to have a presentation from the International Coordination Committee, and apparently it's about ducks. Don Thibault, take it away.
I'll just wait for Dave Cox to finish his conversation, and then we can begin our presentation. Just take your time, Dave. No problem. Pete, you done? You good? Okay. All right. If I could have your attention, what I'd like to do is to give you a brief overview of the International Committee. And this is in two parts. I'll give the overview, and then we'll have a deep dive into some content by Colin Wallace. So what you may want to do is to keep your ducks in a row for this conversation. So the mission of the International Committee is a bit different than others. One could say we are in the bridge building business. The International Committee has to create a bridge between the work here in NSTIC and others. Just didn't want to interrupt the conversation, that's all. So we're in this bridge building business, but I prefer the notion of a viaduct. So you may ask, why a duck? And I would say the duck really does, the viaduct gives a sense of the fundamental mission of the International Committee, which is this two-way exchange of information between the NSTIC and the IDESG and like-minded organizations elsewhere in the world. So it is both the outbound communication that the International Committee concerns itself with, that is to communicate what the IDSG is doing to communities of interest, like-minded communities in other countries. It's also the notion of inbound communication, trying to take best practices, the work being done elsewhere, to the attention of the IDSG so that they can be better informed about other best practices and use cases elsewhere. This is a picture of the International Committee. We are a small group, but we have a number of expertise. We try and substitute volume, or actually quality for quantity. So what do? Well, the first thing we have done is that we survey what's going on in elsewhere, in other places. We have a survey methodology that is quite scientific. For example, in our very first survey, we wanted to inventory all of the organizations around the globe that kind of looked like NSTIC. So we applied the duck principle to that. We didn't take an exhaustive or analytical approach. We simply gathered as quickly as we could all of the NSTIC-like organizations in an inventory and spreadsheet so that we could communicate with them more effectively. And then we take a closer look at key issues and opportunities that are occurring elsewhere so that we can bring that learning back to this room, to the plenary, to the management committee, and to various other work groups. And then we share the implications of what's happening elsewhere with the IDSG. We've done that in 3 different cases that we'll be talking about today. While we were doing the NSTIC survey and began to engage other governments, other private sector, other public-private sector partnerships, we thought we would be talking to them a lot about this. But it turns out that they wanted to talk about this. So that gives you a sense of outbound and inbound communications. The first project we engaged in after our international survey was one that we thought would be particularly important. We began to look at the convergence of government identity and banking identity. We thought that, along with privacy, along with trust marks, would be the kinds of things that we should take a deep dive on. One of the ways that we do this is that we consult the domain expert. The domain expert in this case is a guy named Colin Wallace, and that's a picture of Colin right there. That's a Kiwi for those of you guys that don't know. But you'll be hearing later from Colin about a deep dive into this convergence notion of identity in this space. The second piece that we thought would be particularly important, and this is underway now, is looking at privacy, particularly the implications of what's happening in the EU with the work that we're doing here. Now, as in the case of Colin's work and this work, we are not pretending to be Gartner or Forrester. Rather, we're taking this very broad survey and we're really assembling a report of links. We want to be able to provide, again, working groups and committees, Plenary and others, an easy reference guide, a framework, if you will, for looking at the learning, the contrast and comparison between what's happening, in this case, in the EU and elsewhere. Here's a picture of the guy that's leading that. This is Herbert, has been doing a tremendous amount of work, and we will be issuing his report to the committees sometime in the next month or so. The fourth project that we have just decided to initiate is to look at the implications of trust marks, again, elsewhere in the global ecosystem, and try and bring some of that learning back to the US. We want to make sure that the conversation that we have here around trust marks is informed by the work that's been done globally around trust marks. We also want to make sure that we are communicating on behalf of the IDESG effectively to those other international constituencies how trust marks are being thought of and developed within the context of the IDESG. This is particularly important because, as many of you know, in Europe and in elsewhere, trust marks are picking up a tremendous amount of speed. They are beginning to be instantiated in places like Europe and Asia and elsewhere. We want to get that information as quickly as possible in the hands of folks like you, the Plenary, and the Trust Framework and Trustmark group here. I've appointed myself the temporary domain expert on this because that's what you have to do in these kinds of groups. You have to go first in the hopes that others will follow. One of the other aspects of building bridges is the liaison activity that occurs within the International Coordination Group. I should say that it's important to make a distinction here between the work of the International Coordination Group and that of the Management Council and ultimately the Board of Directors. A liaison activity is an official communication between representatives, in this case of the IDESG organization, and those of others. And I'm pleased to report that we've got the first model done, the first contract signed between the IDESG and, in this case, a group called EMA. This is important because EMA really is leading the conversation in many aspects in the EU. And we wanted to make sure that that liaison agreement was in place so that we would be well prepared for presentations that are now planned for EMA activities in London the first week of June. So Jeremy, Mike Garcia representing the NPO, myself, Russ Chong, and others representing the International Committee will be on panels and making presentations at that meeting in London, at a follow-up meeting in Brussels at the Gemalto Conference, and in others now planned so that we will be representing as best we can the IDESG in these international venues, in these conferences. We're using these conferences quite deliberately because we want to work wholesale, not retail. We want to be able to talk directly to communities of interest that assemble around these kinds of conferences and these kinds of workshops so that our communications back and forth are as efficient as possible. The other piece that's important here is that we see these reports that we referred to earlier, the project on the implications of privacy, the work that Colin will be talking about around banking and government identity is not only the way of exchanging information, both inbound and outbound, but also the way of documenting that information for the benefit of the plenary. You may recall at the last Atlanta plenary, we heard directly from the UK Identity Assurance Program in the form of David Rennie. David gave an overall kind of an overview of the status of that important program in the UK. They have the both political and programmatic imperative of moving some 40 to 60,000 Britons online in the next 2 years. So hearing more and establishing that channel of communication, that bridge, if you will, with the IDAP program, goes a long way towards sharing learning back and forth. The earlier presentations from Michigan and Pennsylvania were a great example of almost mirroring the kinds of work that's being done at the local and their equivalent of the state and local governments in the UK. So we think that the IDESG, the Identity Steering Group in the Identity Assurance Program in the UK, has a lot to offer the IDESG here in the US. The other thing that we want to do is to make sure that we, the International Committee, are not filtering or brokering information. So just as David Rennie from the UK IDAP program directly addressed and took questions from all of you here today and online in Atlanta, we plan and hope to invite Andres from the excuse me, from the EU IDAS task force to address all of us when we meet again in Gaithersburg. So we, the International Committee, want to make sure that we have a cadence of at least every other plenary you're hearing directly from those that are providing leadership to NSTIC-like efforts in other countries and providing the information in advance of those presentations to equip you with use cases, with best practices, so that these presentations are as rich as possible. So we're really pleased to have this kind of bridge building up and running so that it can support your efforts. That's my piece. What I want to do next is to introduce my colleague Colin Wallace, who will be taking you through one of these projects. This is the work being done in this convergence notion. So Colin, if you would, why don't you come up and share at least an executive summary of some of the work that the International Committee has produced to date.
Thanks, Don. Yeah, so I think just to finish to start where Don finished, I just want to say that we don't kind of pick these projects up out of nowhere. You know, we don't. There's no benefit of time. We don't have time now for not invented here. You know, we've actually we're running out of time. We've got to learn what we can from wherever we can and get on with it. And so that's why, you know, we have international folks at the, you know, at the plenaries, because we're listening for those pain points. And this project actually came out of 2 plenaries ago. I think I think the first time we heard about the pain that was happening in the Policy and Financial Services group about the about how banking as an industry just didn't seem to be sort of kind of, we're not getting any kind of headway here with IDESG in that space. And so we took that on board. And okay, it's taken us sort of kind of 6 months to turn it into a project and so on. But that's listening to those pain points. And that's why when Don was talking about trust marks there, and that's, you know, you're thinking, wow, what's the international group doing with trust marks? It's because we heard that pain point today, well, in the last couple of days, about what's happening with trust marks. So we're going to and do that little bit to try and inform what goes on here. So if you give us that luxury, and hopefully we will deliver some value to you. I am absolutely not a subject matter expert in identity banking systems. I knew nearly nothing about it. I've been involved in identity pretty deeply for 10 years, and I'm humbled by the amount of stuff that I still have yet to learn. But I know a bit more about it than I did a few months ago. So this is what we did, basically. Let's see if I can get this to go for us. Yeah. We actually took three completely different systems, and actually those who were looking carefully might have seen that the actual title on my slide deck was different than that title there, because that's one of the things we changed yesterday. Because the original title was all about identity systems that leverage banking processes. But the reality is, when we actually went to see these, that wasn't actually the case. In the case of the Stork 2 banking pilot, it's completely the other way around. It's the banking systems that are leveraging an identity system. And in fact, that's the same in New Zealand as well. That's how open online bank accounts in New Zealand. It's one of the reasons why we did this, because bank accounts, can be opened online elsewhere in the world. And I think also in the US, but there seems to be some sort of kind of reticence to kind of get involved, and yet we're all running to the same anti-money laundering, counter-fraud, terrorism standards. So how's it possible that you could have such a different reaction between one country's banking industry and another? But anyway, hopefully by the end of this we'll have a little more of an idea. So we used Secure Key, and we looked at that Canadian federal deal. Of course, you're seeing it in a slightly different way here as F6, but this is Secure Key Concierge as it's used in the Canadian federal government, where they're leveraging the online banking credentials of their citizens to access government services. The next one we looked at was Bank ID Norway. And one of the things we learned is that Bank ID Norway is very different from Bank ID Sweden, which is actually very different from some of the other Bank ID in the Scandinavian countries. Interestingly, while the banks are actually the same, in most cases the banks are the same, they have such patriotism that they refuse to use somebody else's service. They have to make it, sort of recreate it again in a different country. Scott David made the very intelligent remark that maybe it might be an idea to sort of kind of open source the code so that they don't have to kind of go and reinvent it again. So we've got Bank ID Norge and the Stork 2 banking pilot. Now that was interesting. Completely different set of banks. Nothing to do with any of the Bank ID, the Scandinavian Bank ID banks. So those were the three we chose, and they're very different in their own right. Now this is not going to be all pictures, I'm afraid. This is pretty horrible. So I'm going to sort of flick through. When we began this analysis, we ended up with the group. God bless them, and give most of the credit here to Patrick Curry, who has an ability to write, at biblical proportions. So we ended up with an analysis criteria that I think stretched to 5 pages. So when we first got the first presentation, I think Secure Key struggled through to get it down a little bit. Bank ID Norway said, please give us some guidance here to get this down to something. And this is kind of the criteria that we ended up having to do our analysis on. So you see, it's very benefits orientated, and the reason for that is that we heard from you guys that seemed to be the crux of the issue from the banking industry in the US. What's the value proposition? Why would we get involved? What's the benefit to us? And that's what we sort of tried to explore there. Some of the other things are important as well, because then as soon as you kind of get them on board with we kind of get the value proposition, but what about liability, but what about a governance, but what about this and that? So that's kind of how the analysis criteria got developed. Secure Key. Okay, so we had a whole plethora of things here. I'm not going to really go through them in any great detail, but you can actually see a couple of things that came out of that. Obviously, there was there were benefits all around. There were benefits for the users because they could just reuse their online banking credential. They didn't have to go any further than that. Benefits for the relying parties because they wouldn't have to then issue a whole other set of tokens and all the costs that's associated with that. So there was a sort of a double win there. And of course, in the middle of that was Secure Key and the broker and the potential that there is, that in the Canadian government's case, they're paying a little bit of money for each of those credentials, those tokens, as those folks log in. So you had this sort of kind of triple whammy of benefit, which seems to make the system work quite well. Secure Key is well known for its privacy-enhancing design, and I know that the US is sort of aware of that and learning from that. It's another story how Canada got to know some of those secrets, but that only a few people know where they might have got that from, but they didn't invent it all themselves, I can assure you. So that is primarily the summary from Secure Key. The other thing, look very much at that bottom one. Look at that adoption rate. 50% of the population in 2 years. It's 15 million people in 2 years out of 30 million in Canada. I mean, that is quite fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So, if you think around the identity system, is it in the ecosystem anywhere? Have you ever seen a statistic like that? So that's very interesting to note. I do want to say, however, that while it might be good to apply that to an F6 scenario, remember that the use case is completely different, and so you may find don't necessarily expect that you would have the same adoption rate in the way that you're seeing in Canada. But I just want to point that out. So we went on to Bank ID Norway. Great people, and we had a fascinating presentation from them. Time zone's always a problem here. But out of this, what we found was that different from Secure Key, where it was a federal contract and the governance is really with the contract holders, the federal government are meeting in the room, making sure they're complying to their SLA and so on. In the case of Bank ID Norway, it's actually the Norwegian Banking Industry and Savings Banks Associations who have effectively club funded what is effectively a PKI solution, both for browser and mobile and desktop. Cost them a fair amount too, as you can see, to keep that system running. But they've got over that, something that I think Dave Cox mentioned this morning about, or it was one of the pilots that, as soon as we talk to a new set of relying parties, we don't want to federate because we're going to give competition away and all that sort of stuff. Now the Norwegians have got past that. They absolutely understand the value of actually all being in this thing together, leveraging the bank ID. Notice this. So they're leveraging the bank ID, not the Norwegian EID card. They're leveraging the bank ID for a whole range of different services. So what they did strategically was to put themselves into the flow. They put themselves into the flow of a whole range of different services: student loans, car finance, housing, other housing stuff, all manner of things. They were putting themselves into the flow. And what they've done is effectively tilted the balance of power, if you call it that, between the national ID card and the actual thing that's being used, which is their bank ID. I think that was very, very clever. They actually, if you look at their adoption stats, of course, 75% of the population is great, but it's taken them a fair amount of time. Now, give them their due. Back in 2003, 2004, it must have been pretty tough. Early days in this area, the internet penetration rate, even in a place like Norway, would have been much less than it is today. So they've done darn well to get where they're going and make a very strategic play to be in the market like that. Just moving along then. Stork. Now here's the Stork 2 banking pilot, just really about to start and get on the track. So of course the Stork project has had two phases. The phase one was a very early version of SAML and a federation. But basically the idea is that in a member state, in one of those EU countries in a member state, and you've got your EID and you've got some sort of electronic relationship with that country, you want to be able to use that, leverage that in different countries. So the idea, if you imagine if it's a SAML redirect, wherever you are, you're in Iceland and you're trying to open a bank account in Iceland, then basically the identity part of that is redirected back through the Stork hub back to your home country. You might have come from Sweden or Germany or somewhere to pick up your digital identity from that member state and bring that forward. So it seems like it's a double hop before you just to get to that point. So it's kind of interesting to see how this is going to work. But anyway, the other thing, so you can see how it's completely. So the idea here, the motivation was completely different. The motivation didn't come from the banks at all. It came from the EU member states. He said, "God, we've got a national ID program. How the hell are we going to use it?" Right. What we'll do is we'll try and intervene into the banking system so that we can get a use for our national EIDs in a banking context to open a bank account. And that's not actually that dissimilar from New Zealand as well. We don't have, quite that. We don't have a national ID for a start, so we don't have that sort of issue. But there is this notion, particularly with high-level identity assurance, when you need identity assurance at a high level, where there are less transactions that actually work with it, that you have this notion of needing to overplay it all the time, finding a use for it, because it's bloody expensive to set up. And criticising my own employer as many times as I do, they've really had to overplay that to try and find a use for the thing more than the kind of the 20% of the transactions they might have, because they've got to justify this whole bunch of money that's spent on doing it. And that's really a little bit where Stork is at the moment. The banks, however, aren't all that keen. They're struggling with the business case, and the jury's out whether this is actually going to work. But I wanted to just then finish on the last slide, which is really just a brief summary. What's the elevator pitch that we bring back to the IDESG and in particular to the Policy and Finance Committee when they're talking to banks and any of you that are? What are the key things that we've learned? Well, first is you've almost got to have a triple whammy in the business case. You've got to have a benefit all round, benefit for users, benefit for the RPs, and benefit for the IDP. And actually, when it really came down to it, when we looked at it, it was you had to have a revenue stream, an account growth, and a business's service growth. So you had to have sort of kind of growth in three different contexts to make it work. The second thing is, as you saw there, just leverage what you've got. Creating something new just doesn't work, and I think most people, in the room are sort of aware of that. And basically trying to separate trying to work with identity attributes in the context of the AML and CFT requirements, or whatever requirements you have that are country-based. The fourth one was kind of interesting, and certainly one that the pilots are finding too, about the separation of login from identity. It seems like it's an interesting one, because in I sense in the US, being a frequent visitor, there's still a real mix of understanding of there's a misunderstanding between identification and authentication, and while that still continues, and there's not a clear mental separation about login, which can be completely self-asserted, and then applying a set of identity attributes to a self-asserted login and binding them in some way with some other sort of proof. Until we sort of kind of get over there, it's going to be a real fuzzy picture. So it seems that in all of these cases, those three banking scenarios, they got over that. We saw governance models which were both, in the Canadian case, government only, and yet, Bank ID Norway, it was the banks doing it themselves. So it seems that both governance models worked. And it was Scott David who takes credit for the second to last one there about trying to make those patterns freely available. There was no reason why they shouldn't have done, and they take that on board. What was the last one? Okay, yeah. So I just got to read this. This is in green, and it's awful hard for me to read. Yep. So it's basically keep it lightweight, and basically keep the business case compelling. Okay, thank you.
Before you clap, so Colin, I have a question for you. So the two, this is Bob, by the way, from Citi. The Stork project and the Norwegian Bank ID project, your descriptions of the two of them back to back led me to wonder whether there isn't this possibility that the combination will turn the national ID into basically a one-time use KYC token, right? You get your national ID, you use it to get your bank ID, and then you throw away your national ID and use your bank ID for everything else. Do you see that happening somewhere? I mean, it seems an odd concept.
You may think that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Come on, you're from New Zealand. You got no duck in this hunt.
That's not referencing my employer for a moment. I think there's the potential of that. I really do. And we're actually in New Zealand, we're already, even though we don't have an ID system, there's that notion of if one did have it, you could already see it starting to break down. We have a login service with getting on for 50% of the population on it, and so we have a number of things that are sort of kind of working and playing. And yeah, there's less need for the login service that the government stood up. I mean, doesn't have to be that login. It could be any goddamn login, just as long as you have the authoritative source of the attributes that you can bind to it. So yeah, I think it's a possibility. I think that you're seeing that in Bank ID Norway. I think that bus is gone. It's gone. I don't think that the Stork guys, who don't seem to talk to the Bank ID guys, have seen that yet.
Hey, thank you for the chat. This is Aesthetics from the internet. And just a quick question, and this is kind of a broadly scoped deliberately. What kinds of implications do you think an EID type system could have for a country that has no national ID system?
That's a good one. Implications. One of them we've just talked about. What is the business case for it? A lot of the EID policy seemed to be kind of turned around. It was sort of what the government wants out of this rather than what's good for the citizen, and then the case for how the citizen can use it came later, and kind of perhaps not completely thought through from a design process, which is why you're getting these difficulties when you get an EID. Oh, wasn't that great? Okay, now how do I use it? Oh, well, you'll need a reader. And so Austria was the first into this, and Peter was actually working in Austria when all this went down. And Austria then had to rapidly go with trying to find some other way of getting off the card and onto a software base to get their EID system to have any traction. And the 25 million euros. I'm just trying to think what it was to do that change. So, there's expense when you start designing a system that's a bit monolithic and then ask it to do things that it was never intended to do.
Hi, this is Lena Kanapan from 8K Miles Fusion. I have a couple of, one comment and one question. The comment is, in your criteria, it was surprising to see that the challenges around onboarding agencies or applications to the system was missing.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so that's my first comment. Then my question is, if the banks become that, take up the role of an identity provider from a commercial a provider's perspective, what will happen to the mobile operators as we start to think that telcos may become the next generation IDPs? If you look at the early days of this adoption of federation, there's always been a cold war between the mobile operators and the banks. They don't want to go into a same room and have conversations, right? And so I think that's a really a very interesting concern. I think in my mind, what would happen to Canada, for example? You're saying 15 million citizens are already onboarded from an e-pass system to the banks. How would Bell Canada or someone like Rogers will take up the next role of being an IDP?
I'm going to briefly answer those, and I know Don does too. So I think it's a fair point on the first on the first part of your question. Certainly, onboarding was in the long list of things. Funnily enough, it didn't seem to come up as much of an issue, and I guess just because there was sort of some sense of federation. But it's a good point. That's a good point. In the second point, I think Don wants to give you a little more detail on that. But Bank ID Norway, in fact, the majority of that 75%, that they actually showed in the slides, the onset of mobile using a PKI chip, I think, a PKI-enabled chip in the mobile device. So they were starting to work very closely with the mobile operators there, and it felt like a good relationship.
I think Lena's put his finger on really the crux of what's happening this year in identity, which is that you have movement in the banking sector, as Colin began to point out, but important movement in the mobile sector. For example, in the UK government has funded pilots cooperatively with the GSMA. So you have the 4 mobile network operators coming together to experiment in pilots around the user interface, around the authentication, around the verification, to see how a mobile device, the platform of choice for citizens, can be used in government-to-citizen interaction. So you'll see that happen. It's already happening this year in the UK. Perhaps there'll be other tests in Canada and in the US led by the GSMA and other organizations, including my own. So I think this is the year of experimentation. So what causes these big sectors like banking, like mobile, like government to move? And I would suggest it's fear and greed. One of the things that governments, whether they be local, state, federal here in the US or in the UK, is they simply cannot continue the status quo. In an era of declining budgets and increased demand for citizen services, the only answer is to deliver those services online. And the major impediment to delivering services online is solving some of these fundamental problems of identity. I think in the case of the telco sector, the same thing is true. They're fearful of other non-telco players coming over the top. So I think you'll see a tremendous amount of experimentation already spinning up here and in UK and other common law countries that will be the latest battlefield of identity. And Kay, I think you had a question from the internet.
Thank you. I do. I have a couple of comments here from the from the remote audience, and you should feel free to answer right into the cameras because it's not my question, it's theirs. Courtney Brown asks, the role of community-based ID as the authoritative source contributed to the EU bank adoption. In what ways can IDESG support more community-based identity initiatives? And then along with that, Kimberly with no name seconded that, said, Courtney, exactly, and .gov could EID cost wisely by just piggybacking the in-place passport and or driver's license identification processes already in place.
How best to address that question? I think the most important thing is not to theorize, but to watch the pilots currently underway in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and in the localities in the UK, because frankly that's where the pressure is felt most acutely, and I think that's where some of these problems will be solved. Whether they'll be interoperable even within the departments of the state of Pennsylvania or within the U.S. or between the U.S. and other like-minded countries remains to be seen. And I think that's the central concern and the central focus of our committee, is to look for instances of interoperability and to see those lessons learned and to bring them back to this venue.
Just a very quick one from me. It's one of the real challenges that government has, federal and state, is exposing its attributes electronically. What a difference it would have made, perhaps, if the State Department had exposed the 4 pieces of identity information on your passport to answer the online question. So that may have changed the course of history to a certain extent, but it hasn't, and we've got to move on. But there is that kind of collective need to expose your authoritative sources so that they're consumable.
My name is Sitaram Durba from Cable Labs. My question is on the benefits. I think that it's really good to see very succinct list of benefits being listed for both secure key and bank ID. I was wondering what kind of data was used to back up kind of those claims, and any studies used to gather the data.
Not really.
Again, I want to caution you, the project work that we've outlined is not original research. What we're trying to do is to simply harvest up and hoover up the best practices and the pointers we have for where those benefit statements come from. So as we publish the report that Colin talked about, we think, frankly, the most rich part of it is the links that will be allowed. So we are taking prima facie the claims of Secure Key and others from their presentations. So we're not fact-checking or providing any analytical layer on top of that. Again, the role that we have is this bridge function, and the way that we should be judged is how valuable those links are to different working groups, whether they be trust frameworks or the bank and finance ones. So that's not a great answer to your question, but it's an honest one.
I just want to add that I was not trying to hint that we should do those studies. I was just wondering if we have access to the studies that they, Secure Key or Bank ID, have done.
Why don't we take an action then and see if we can't pry that open from our colleagues at Secure Key.
Hi, Sophie Rosman from the U.S. Treasury Department, Office of Consumer Policy. Thank you. So I'm curious if you had the chance to observe trends in other kinds of attribute verification being shared between government and the banking sector. I'm thinking in the U.S., for example, the IRS is a major provider of user permission income verification to banks, or the Social Security Administration is a provider of SSN verification.
Didn't come up specifically. It was probably for the quick fly past that we were doing. Yeah. It was just a little too deep for the time we had to put that together. But it's a very fair point. My sense is that there is certainly with Bank ID Norway. Where the agencies were definitely, the government agencies were consuming the Bank ID, and there was a permissions, a consent-based flow in there as well. I saw it certainly evident in that. Too early to tell in Stork because it's just that pilot's just started. We might see something at the end of the year. For Secure Key, yeah, they didn't really. It's kind of sensitive to talk about what the government might be, using it for. They just said, hey, we're the broker. We're in the, this is what we're doing. They didn't really. They didn't really want to answer that. Whenever we kind of got onto those type of topics, they'd say, oh well, you'll have to go and ask the federal government.
I'm happy to pass the conversation to. We just combined our both. So we're done. And I think the Health Committee is next. Thank you.
So thanks very much to the International Coordination Committee. That's two really interesting presentations at two successive meetings. So I think it's very, very helpful. Thanks, guys. So we now have one more committee update, and the committee update will come from the Healthcare Committee, and Tom Sullivan will present that, and then Peter and I will present some memoriams and recognition to the outgoing officers.
Thank you, Bob. Kay, do you have the slides? So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tom Sullivan. I'm a physician. That's my expertise. I've got like 40 years of patient care practice. I'm not a technical geek guy, but I'm chair of the healthcare industry committee, and it's actually been a great experience. I've been in it since the start, and in terms of the committee report outs, the two breakout sessions we had yesterday and the day before were terrific because we were able to give time to two pilots. And one of them you've heard from Mike Farnsworth, the ANOVA-AMVA pilot in Northern Virginia, and the lessons learned have been absolutely invaluable to us in our healthcare committee going forward. And of course they're still learning, and we're learning from them. The second pilot, the Resilient Networks pilot, presented yesterday, and some of you may know they actually officially ended their pilot stage just 2 days ago, so they were able to give us a nice summary of lessons learned, which I'm going to interpret them. Let's see if I can see my slide there. Yeah, I think I can. I'm going to interpret them a little bit. I did get permission to present their last 3 slides of their summary, which give you a kind of a quick update on what they've learned. Their pilot was following a group of migrant farm workers who would, in the winter, would be working in the San Diego area, and in the summer they'd be working in Oregon, and they wanted to be able to connect the health. And so the part of the challenge, which I won't go into in any detail, is some of these migrant workers were undocumented, so identity proofing is much more complicated there. Not to say that identity proofing the doctors in California and Oregon was any less difficult, but that's one of the lessons learned in this project. That's one of the emphasis points that they made, and what they learned from that. So next slide. So I'm not sure if you can you see that slide, but I'm going to go through a little bit of it myself, and I'm going to get a little closer to look at it. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these. I'm just going to pick out a couple of points. And again, this is their list of lessons learned and the potential solutions. I'll pick the ones that I'm most familiar with. And again, if I didn't say it, I did have permission from Britt and to present these slides, but they were they're all available, and they will be on our document repository in the healthcare area. So the first one of challenges, sustainable revenue. Business drivers take priority in the ecosystem before privacy and security. So we're very much focused on identity proofing, privacy, confidentiality, security, but the end users and the vendors here are saying, we cannot do this unless there's a business case. And I think we all know that, but they just wanted to point out from their experience, there's got to be a sustainable revenue in this. And the first step, sure, privacy, security, identity, but they've got to make a way, find out a way to make this pay for itself. So e-referrals is one of the things that they were doing. So no longer is it the doctor says to the farm worker, gee, you've got a cardiac murmur and blah, 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 and you need to see a specialist. And how are we going to do this electronic referral, especially most of your records in San Diego, and now you're in Oregon, and we've got to identify a doctor and send them the information. How do we do that? So their point is the state of e-referrals nationwide right now, the adoption is pretty low, but there's a great need for it. And I think, again, these are rather obvious. At least they're obvious to a physician. And I'd like to say, ultimately, if you're not a patient, you're going to be a patient sometime in the future. Even if you're healthy, we're into wellness now, not just disease management. The other point, and I think this was brought up in several of the existing methods of doing referrals and identities, they're very entrenched. I mean, the healthcare profession is relying on faxes and phone calls. Before faxes and phones, and we can go back a long time, it was writing something on paper and handwriting and bringing it or sending it in the mail to another doctor, and that would take a long time. So as in my case, for many years, I'd go to the emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning seeing a patient who's having an acute myocardial infarction. And they got all kinds of records all over the place, but I can't get them right then and there. They were not electronic. And even if they were paper, I'd go in and I'd look at a patient. He said, "Oh yeah, I've been here several times." And then the record store in the hospital would bring me 10 volumes of medical records. So now people are using phones and faxes, and I think you all know this, and it's our system of identity proofing and then exchanging information has to be better than that. It has to be more convenient at that. It has to streamline. It has to be the same cost or lower cost. And so, again, this is one of their lessons learned. The existing applications for healthcare information exchanges, what they call the HIEs, that's not a health insurance exchange. It's an HIE, health information exchange, and I'll give you a little bit of sidebar on that in a minute after I finish this. So they're built on the hub and spoke models, whereas apparently the web services models are more edge related things. I'm getting a little deep into the weeds here, but the way the current generally state run HIEs work is on an older model, and it isn't as efficient as what they were trying to do. So that's another challenge and a barrier. And then the current regulations don't place much emphasis on the privacy impact to health IT users. We've sort of taken for granted privacy, confidentiality, and security. And so introducing a system of stronger identity, more convenient, they say, well, why? Why isn't what we do now good enough? So, again, that's one of the challenges. And again, I don't want to go through this whole list, but in the first bullet on the second, solution potentials, meaningful use. If you're not familiar with that, the federal government, back when David Blumenthal was the head of the Office of National Coordinators, got about $28 billion or so, give or take a few billion, to incentivize the adoption of electronic medical records throughout the country. And to date, they've spent about $22 billion in payments to hospitals and physicians that have met certain criteria, what they call meaningful use. It's not enough just to record the patient's history or whatever else. And again, what does this have to do with identity proofing? Well, you have to have a certified electronic medical record. It has to be certified by an independent party, and there are a bunch of criteria. So that has really spurred the adoption of electronic healthcare IT, and we're hoping we can continue with that. Lightweight exchange, I'll just jump over that. And also they're saying that the minimal impact for user convenience was a key to adoption. I already said that. Why don't I stop there, ask if there's any one or two questions, and then I'll go to the next. Quick, go ahead, Kay.
This is a remote question from Courtney Brown. The U.S. governance model defers most citizen, community identity, and service issues to the states. The Michigan pilot stopped just short of investigating the task of providing identity services without exporting data. There is a long history in the U.S. of federal support for interstate activities. The Full Faith and Credit Act, the Interstate Highway System, and recently health care coverage exchanges. Could the IDESG benefit from a pilot that specifically investigates authentication and authorization, in parentheses, auth/auth, between states?
That sounds like a pretty broad question. I'm not sure that it relates very much to healthcare, but I would say the quick answer is yes. They could benefit. Again, I don't know if that really gets to the question. I'm just saying, we're all hoping for big-time coordination, reuse, and yet, something that enhances privacy, something that follows the NSTIC principles. The answer, yes, could benefit. Next slide, Kay. So the ecosystem, the patient care coordination. When I was listening to the ecosystem definitions yesterday, I heard about biomes and biologic systems. To me, an ecosystem is a system that is interdependent. There's a dependency. In order to survive and thrive, there's a dependency of a number of parties on one another. The importance, I think, of interchange and interoperability, the way I would, to try to use the language that we often use. So the business priorities, the real world is, if it's not sustainable, it's not going to happen. So they're saying they take precedence. We need to demonstrate software beyond authentication and authorization. And again, we're focused on the identity ecosystem, but that's just the beginning. What people really want to get to is the meat of it, the content. Okay, this helps us with to prevent fraud, reduce, help with inefficiency problems, but the real meat is showing a business case and exchanging clinical information for us. Simple methods that currently meet the requirements are likely to be unchanged without significant incentives. And I just gave you an example of that. But I'll also say what the government and I'll say private payers giveth, they also take away. Some of you may know that yesterday the U.S. Senate passed yet another law that says for the 17th time since 1997 they're not going to get rid of the sustainable growth formula, what is often called the doc fix. And so they kicked the can down the road again for multiple years. And they also said we're going to delay ICD-10. If some of you know, that's a new system of diagnosis that most of the rest of the world uses. The small practices are very much against it. The big hospitals and big practices wanted it. Everybody's angry. Nobody's happy. But anyway, incentives must be there to move the system faster, and the meaningful use stuff that I just talked about is helping with the identity proofing, the whole ecosystem. And I'd also like to say, I know Jeremy had to leave yesterday and Jim is not here, but we had a great session at the HIMSS, the Health Information Management Systems Society annual meeting. Gets about 35,000 people. Hillary Clinton was one of the speakers. We just had it about a month ago in Orlando. And Mike presented, the Deputy Director of the Office of the National Coordinator there. Doug Fritzma was there, and Jeremy spoke, and it was, I think, a promise of future collaboration between a very important arm, a federal agency that didn't exist 15 years ago, and IDESG. So that's very promising, and we're thinking that those incentives are going to hopefully continue. Information sharing trumps identity and authentication. I already referred to that. Again, a lesson learned. But identity and authentication is absolutely necessary before you do that information sharing. And then local level resources, where the point of greatest need, they're scarce. So the example of rural Oregon and San Diego, again, we need to beef up these information exchanges. Final slide. This is just a picture. Again, this is on the IDES website. Shows a graphic that makes it a little bit easier to talk about. And so I want to make some quick final observations. I have a lot of hope for the future of what we're doing here, but I must admit we're at a critical stage. We're transforming now. The ancien régime is out, and the newcomers are in. And thankfully, it wasn't a revolution; it was planned. Right. So, but we're at a critical stage. When we first started out in healthcare, we had some big players attending our meetings. Not so much now, but we have 4 very knowledgeable physicians who call in almost every time, every other week, including the father of the HIPAA privacy rule, Bill Braithwaite, and he is now the new chair of the HIMSS Identity Task Force. And Jeremy and I think Jim were very, very happy because they have the ability to bring in the big commercial private sector vendors. So we're very hopeful. We're going to be collaborating quite a bit. And there are several members who share membership in our committee and that task force. And the other thing, I'm liking what I hear from the non-healthcare committees is this new collaboration between the identity ecosystem and the state governments. That is going to have a big implication for us in healthcare because of so much power that each state Department of Public Health or other related entity has. I'm particularly focused on the controlled substance identity proofing for electronic prescribing, and the DEA has issued some very, very strict regulations, but each state has the ability to add to those identity proofing, and every state is very jealous of its own business processes, and you heard it in the other presentations this morning, and it's just as true in terms of healthcare. So thank you. Any other questions? I'm sorry I went beyond my time.
Dr. Tom, you might want to share the experience of New York, the state of New York, and the positive return that can happen, because I think it's a benchmark.
Yeah, so to give an example, New York State, their legislature about 2.5 years ago passed a law called ISTOP, and it was to deal with the major national crisis of opioid overdoses and abuses, fraud, illegal diversion. And so they said, okay, we know the DEA has these rules, but we're gonna add some additional ones. And what they did was they mandated that as of the end of March 2015, all prescriptions in the state of New York, all prescriptions must be electronic, including controlled substances, narcotics. They're the only state in the country that has this. But they also mandated that as of last August 27, every doctor must consult what's called the PDMP, the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. Now, every state has their own PDMP. It's not run by the federal government. So every state has a different way of identity proofing for that. And they just released about a month ago their 6-month results. Just by making this PDMP access, so the doctor has to look at this database and see if the patient in front of them has actually gotten a controlled substance in the last few days or whenever. Just by accessing that database, they've cut the doctor shoppers in New York by 75%. That's a big number. I can't tell you how many doctor shoppers there were. I just know there's 95,000 people in New York who write prescriptions, and they've all had to sign up for this. So I think other states are going to... Now, that's a law enforcement issue, and we want to be able to tie the controlled substance identity so that if you pass that really tough identity proofing that the DEA and the state has, you ought to get immediate access into the PDMP. which is a slightly different database, and that's.
So it's more than a law enforcement issue. Of course, it's an issue of liability for the physicians, because if you're taken in by too much doctor shopping, you can be sued and prosecuted and things. So it's a really good thing for the doctors.
Yes, it's a win-win. It's a win-win. We're hoping other states will follow, but there isn't any standardization. That's something that IDESG can bring to the state governments. So there's a number of us working on this, but the power of NSTIC, the principles in IDESG, is yet to be realized.
So thanks very much, Tom. As usual, fascinating. So we have about 5 minutes till Peter and I are scheduled to do the recognitions, and we're trying to get a few of the former officers on the phone line, so I don't want to start early. I think Denise Taylor would like to make a short announcement about something which we can probably use up the 5 minutes. So if you'd come up, Denise. You can do it from there.
Yesterday, and I see people are wearing their Online Privacy Matters stickers. I appreciate that. We just launched the Online Privacy Matters website, so onlineprivacymatters.com, and it just launched, so if you find bugs, please report back. But I would... Yeah, or advice, whatever you have to offer. You're going to see there that we're going to highlight, we're asking people to support, to sort of sign up and say that you care, take a stance. We're asking people that have things that they'd like to have us add as quotes. If you have stats that you think people need to hear about that are unique to your industry or that are interesting, please provide those. We're going to be launching the Employee Benefits Program, which will allow employers to offer free kid credentials to the employees' children. They'll come with a cool little grab bag of electronic goodies, trading cards and swords for their virtual worlds and other things. And also, of course, educating them about the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. So please go to onlineprivacymatters.com. And Andy, what did you want to say? We want your companies to support us, so please take a look at what we have there, and if you have a company that can stand up and support us, let us know. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm going to, since we still have a few minutes until noon, and we do want to have the people we're recognizing in the room and online, I'm going to invite Colin Wallace to come up and give us another brief update.
Guys, I'm just going to try and use this short amount of time, and I want Phil to come up as well, please. we were gonna raise something in general business later this afternoon. We appreciate a lot of people are going, and we just wanted to very quickly raise this. And it started off with a conversation with Phil and I, and then with Denise and Andrew. It was actually, I think it was Andrew rather than Denise from Privo last night, and we want to try it out on you. We all struggle with value propositions for what we're doing here. And there's been talk in the past, but we really haven't nailed it down. What implication is there insurance-wise? So the conversation went last night something like this. I'd been thinking about cybersecurity, and there's some insurance implications there that some of you may be aware of, where, if you're basically not protecting your network well enough, it's proven, then in fact an insurance company could bump your premium up. So in other words, mitigating for cybersecurity risk would reduce your premium. It's thinking, well, they could extend to online. And then Phil came up with this idea.
So there's been a lot of conversation about what the value proposition of IDESG was, and I forget the gentleman the other day who made the comment that, I couldn't, in a 100-story elevator ride in a slow elevator, explain to someone who wasn't familiar with the space what the value is. And so in just sort of generally thinking about these things, I thought about trust marks, and one of the ones that came to mind, at least here in the U.S., is Underwriter Laboratories. And I haven't had a chance to really dig into this, but my question is, and if anybody knows the answer, this will help us kickstart the ball. Why do manufacturers take the time and effort to get their products reviewed by Underwriters Laboratory. My speculation is, okay, let me finish painting the question for folks. My speculation was that it has to do with potentially reductions in product liability insurance or other type of things like that. If there were an ability, to leverage Colin's idea, to generate reductions in insurance costs for businesses who participate in an identity ecosystem where we know a little bit more about the business partners, that could potentially be a fairly easy to articulate value proposition to organizations for potentially joining. John, you've got some. Okay.
John Vick of Microsoft. In a former life, I worked for an electric power tool manufacturing company, and we used Underwriters Labs for all of our tools, put their logo, their trust mark on our tools. Our business rationale for doing it was really three things. First, there was market pressures that compelled us to do it. We sold a lot of our tools through like hardware stores, and those guys wouldn't put anything electric into their distribution channel if it wasn't UL approved. Their motivation was reducing liability. We felt there was a minor reduction in liability because it was essentially a safe harbor, because the UL requirements represented the state-of-the-art in electrical safety testing. And so, if we were complying with the state-of-the-art and something went wrong, how could people sue us? And the third reason was that it seemed like the tests that they compelled us to do seemed like very rational tests. Our own engineers looked at them and go, yeah, of course we do that test. So it was a relatively low barrier for us because we would have been doing it anyway. And to your point, I think all of those apply to what we're doing here, all three of those things.
So don't run off, because I'm going to ask you a question again now. So do you know if, on the back end of that, whether it was the manufacturers or the retailers of those products, do you know if they realized a differential in cost, whether it's insurance premiums or their own internal risk organizations who meet them set aside money in case they get sued or something like that?
I can't speak to the narrow question of reduction in insurance premiums, but our two largest customers claimed that their insurance carrier required them to do it, so that's pretty close.
Okay. So I guess the only other question then to the audience, would be, does anybody have contacts with insurance companies who offer this kind of liability insurance that we could maybe draw in and get some feedback from them as to whether this would be a rational thought? Yes.
Great. Yeah. And obviously that's pitched very much as an open question. The reason I wanted to make an additional comment was, and this is to, I suppose, more to the lawyers in the audience, and I am not a lawyer, but many of the people here, lawyers or not, are also following the quite interesting work in the American Bar Association and their task force on identity management, and there's some interesting conversations going over there. And I'd posted something about a month ago about trying to get my head around a sort of parallel with a concept around market share liability. One of the principles in cases where somebody wants to make a complaint about something and get some compensation or damages for a situation where they know they've been caused harm by some product, but they're not quite sure which of generically equivalent products it was that caused the harm. In other words, they can't identify exactly the manufacturer of that particular orange juice or that particular motor oil or other product which is essentially fungible across different suppliers. There's a principle in law about shared market liability which says, well, and it's the onus of proof is actually on the defendants to show that none of the market was liable, failing which there is an award made to the plaintiff in proportion to the market share of the different operators. And the question I raised was, in that context, if we think of personal data, not personal information, which is data in context, but personal data as being something that at the level of bits and bytes is essentially fungible, it's bits and bytes, whoever's carrying it. If there is an exposure to risk of personal data because it's been leaked by one party, is there a similar concept in law of using market share liability, where you could say, well, I'm not particularly concerned who let go of the bits of data, whether it was on a backup disk that's got lost in somebody's laptop or a failure at a data center or whatever. The fact is, a harm has been done, and everybody that was involved in using that data should be held liable using the market share liability question. The reason I raised that was, does that, whatever the answer to that is, does it give us some insight into issues about insurance, lowering risks, looking at issues how you quantify the risk and the value around personal data? So I just wanted to chip that in.
Let's let Kim comment, and then we'll move on to the next session.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is that when Phil was having that conversation at dinner last night, the other thing that I thought about was that depending on the individual, a UL trust mark has a different feeling. So, for example, maybe companies use that UL symbol and have value there, but someone buying a product may not always know that. And so I was thinking of other types of things that might be more familiar, like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval from the consumer side of things. Some people do look for a UL listing, and they're not going to get that light bulb or that power tool without the UL. But just remembering that as we look at this broad stakeholder group, again, even a trust mark may not have relevance in some markets or for some stakeholders.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, so now we are coming to the portion of the agenda immediately before lunch, and this is a really important session. So, as everybody knows, we are a volunteer organization, which means that all of the progress that we make depends on the efforts of people who are taking those efforts either out of their personal lives or out of the time that they owe to their employer, presumably with their employer's consent. It's a significant service, a service both to the organization and to the country, because this is a national initiative. We have a number of people who have performed notable services in positions on the Management Council and elsewhere, who aren't going to be continuing in those positions, and we wanted to recognize them today. So the first person we want to recognize is Don Tebow, who has been a member of the Management Council, will not be a member of the Management Council in this next cycle. And Don, so if you could come up. So Don, of course, has also made significant contributions in his International Coordination Committee role, and we're grateful, Don, to you for both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's very much appreciated. Hold it up so that the camera can see it, yes. Next, we have two people who aren't with us in person, and I don't know whether either or both are on the phone. So the first is another outgoing member of the Management Council, Lee Tien. Is Lee on the phone? Okay, so Lee wasn't able to be here with us today. So we have Lee's certificate, and again, we're grateful to Lee for his service on the Management Council, and we will be getting this certificate to him. I think maybe we'll have some sort of duck delivery mechanism to do that. And the next person we want to recognize, and who I personally want to recognize, is Daza Greenwood. Has Daza gotten onto the okay, good. So Daza is presumably listening, which means that I get to embarrass him by saying effusive things about him here. So Daza has been my vice chair in the plenary. And I spoke to him last night, and one of the things that I said was that he provided, I think, what was an absolutely critical service to the organization. So he put together the dashboard mechanism that we use to run the chair's call and to facilitate communication between the chairs and coordination between the committees on the work that we do. And I sort of, and my feeling is that we really transitioned from focusing primarily on organizational issues and sort of getting ourselves in order to primarily focusing on generating work products at the time that we began using the dashboard mechanism to track our progress. It's not too surprising that you get what you track. I think it's a truism. But DAZA did a really important service to the organization here, and I want to recognize that. So DAZA will not be continuing as vice chair of the plenary, but DAZA, thank you very much for your contributions here. I'll hold up your certificate in case you're watching on the webcast. You can look at it, and we will, of course, be winging this off to Cambridge to get it to you. But DAZA, if you're on the line, if you wanted to say a few words, that would be appropriate. We're manipulating the audio. I hear nothing. Daza, are you on mute? Is Daza in the chat channel communicating with us that he's unable to talk to us?
Hello.
Oh, there you are. Hi, hey, Daza.
Terrific. Great. Hi, thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. I don't have much substantive to say other than it's been just on a personal level, just very satisfying to be able to pitch in and make this, make the dream of NSTIC that much closer to reality. So, I encourage those that are taking office and who are about to be seated to, really give it your all, because now, in a sense, now what we've done in the last term is got to the start line. So it's on, and I wish all the best to those of you that are continuing, and I appreciate the recognition, Bob. So with that, I'll see you in a Birds of a Feather session in a few minutes.
Just to cap out that appreciation to Daza, I wanted to add that the session that Kim and I did yesterday on ecosystem or framework, the person who did a lot of the heavy lifting to get us there at the very, very early stages, and I remember the session we had at IIW a couple of years on that, was Daza, who actually painstakingly went through every single policy document, starting with the national strategy document, to look out every reference to the term identity ecosystem framework, to actually pull out, well, what is the X that these terms refer to? And I think that started that thread of ideas and comments which culminated in part of the presentation there. So a personal thank you to Daza there as well. So we have three more people that we want to honour. We have on the line a Kimberly no last name, so in order to sort of restore some balance to the universe, we want to honour Kimberly with two last names. Now, she's not actually leaving us as much as she's transitioning from one hat, work under one hat as, or actually, there's three hats she wears. She's transitioning from one hat as a elected member from stakeholder category in the Management Council, and transitioning to the new hat to take over the baton from Bob as plenary chair, and for the moment at least, and we hope to press Ganga to continue in that role, also to serve as an officer of the corporation, as one of the three required officers under state law as the treasurer of IDESG as a corporation. It's been immense pleasure working with her on the Management Council, someone who's always there with a big broad smile, but she's a tough cookie behind that. Kim's not someone you want to mess with, but she has a way of telling you what your place is, and you go away thinking that she's just giving you a very, very nice piece of advice that you quite welcome. That's right, Southern Charm. And so thank you for the service you provided up till now, and also for being willing to continue in a new function. It probably means you'll be collecting these certificates as you go along, but don't expect too many, all right?
So let me say a few things before we give the microphone to Kim. So the other thing I think we ought to recognize Kim for is the absolutely critical role that she played in doing the planning that got us to the point where we could become an incorporated entity. And that was a really significant piece of work, and it took a lot of time and effort. And on a personal note, I'd like to say I cannot possibly think of a better person to succeed me in the plenary chair role. I hope all of you will forget any benefits that I brought to the organization and just be awed by what she does in the future. Kim.
Well, I really don't have much to say at all, but I really enjoyed being a stakeholder representative. I had an active group of people that are still in the room, and I'll be passing the torch on as well, and our new stakeholder representative is going to be amazing as well. So I really think that what we're doing with IDESG is really important work, and I just am excited to take on all the work that Bob and all of you have kind of laid out. We do have a lot of work to do moving forward.
Thank you very much. So the next person I want to recognize, and I don't want to get too close to him because I think the shirts are going to clash. If I were to give away, apart from the shirts, sort of 4 sort of identity attributes, I think they'd probably be able to uniquely identify him in the world. Not only an avid photographer, a classic scholar, identity geek, and somebody in that scary world of business finance, and particularly in coming from a major bank as one of our key stakeholder representatives here. Bob, it's difficult to give justice to the work and the contribution that Bob has given to the organization. But I think the most lasting legacy, and the thing that I take away from Bob's contribution to the organization since we kicked off, has been an absolute devotion to consensus building and to really looking into all the darkest corners of the collective psyche of this organization, to move the attention away from the spotlight of the buzz of the people who talk too much like myself, and to look for those areas where some people are a little less confident in speaking, a little less sure about the position they want to take, but not entirely happy with the majority view. And I think Bob's consistent devotion to seeking not just consensus as a passive, okay, most people agree, let's move on, but to actively seek out and bring people on board, to articulate and to stand for somebody who may be on their own or maybe only representing a small group of people, to actively engage them in a conversation and to actively engage everybody in a conversation to build an active consensus and to really drive that forward, I think has been, for me, one of the most lasting elements that will stick with me in terms of the contribution that Bob's made. Through the course of 8 plenaries, he's been willing to listen and to follow the flow of conversation and to help build those sort of active consensus, but brings to the table a knowledge of the domain in all its glory, in all its messiness, but also in all its detail, that has helped inform us all and make us all a better organization as a result. And I don't know what more to say except that I'm going to miss your charm, your dry sense of humor, and the fun we've had together in the sessions and in some of the informal sessions, and catching up on sort of weird musical tastes and other stuff. But I'm glad that you will be staying with the organization. I live in a little bit of trepidation of what that's going to mean once he can take off his, yes indeed, you can see just from the body language, transitioning from a position where he's trying to build consensus, hopefully continue to build consensus, but really start contributing also some of his own personal ideas and those of his organization. And with that, Bob, just to thank you so much for everything you've done. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I look forward to your continued involvement in the organization.
So I will say that this is a rare certificate in that it actually spells my last name right. That almost never happens. The only other thing that I want to say, because I'll be saying a few other things later before I step off the stage, is I appreciate the enormous amount of support that I've gotten from everybody in the organization in terms of both advice and, in some cases, forbearance for ideas that I had. So it's really been a pleasure working with everybody in this role, and I will see you next time.
Now I think the last one is probably going to be a bit of a double act between Bob and I, and this is going to be totally improvised because neither of us are prepared for this. But there is one other person who is not elected, was not on the management councils, not leading the plenary, but has nonetheless been absolutely key and a backbone to the organisation, and to a lot of our consternation and shock at the beginning of the week, we learnt that she's going to be leaving us, and that's Kay. So Kay, I know you're going to, no hiding away in the corner there, come on up. Kay has been not just my go-to person as chair of the management council to ensure a flow of meetings when I've lost my notes or I'm not sure what's coming up next. You know, that's stuff that quite a few people can do, but Kay does it in a particularly efficient way. But there's a lot of stuff that Kay does that none of you see and few of us see, and that is on the phone every day, reaching out both to people who are not present at the meetings or who have been present at the meetings and left dissatisfied with something, or people who are not yet in the organisation and but are sort of hesitating on the sidelines and thinking about joining, or beyond that trying to reach out to new potential members. Kay has unstintingly given her all in terms of trying to build the momentum behind this organisation of bringing us together as a collective. And I think the sort of collective culture that we've built up as an organisation in a relatively short period of time will stand as a lasting legacy for Kay's involvement there. Our loss is another organisation's gain. We hope not only that you will sign. Have you signed the membership agreement yet?
No, not yet.
Okay, all right. Well, we're going to have to get on to it.
Well, Jeremy's still waiting to sign it.
That's right. Yeah, this is going to be countersigned by 3 people, so you know. But I'm sure in one way or another our paths are going to cross either in IDESG, hopefully not in front of law courts or anywhere else with district attorneys. But I feel confident just from your personality and your interest in this area of work, which was relatively new scope of work for you, that your enthusiasm in what you've been doing and the willingness to engage with people is something which will also be something that will stick with you. And Bob, over to you.
Yeah, so I guess I'll pile on a little bit. So Kay has done a really remarkable job of keeping a very complicated organization functioning, and to the extent that I've ever appeared organized to any of you, that is mostly because I'm getting text messages in real time telling me what it is that I'm supposed to look like I know I'm doing at the next moment. But there's also an enormous amount of behind the scenes work on everything from managing the sort of finances and day-to-day activities of the organization to the agendas for these events to logistics and all kinds of just putting out fires. So there are a lot of things that happen that could cause us to function less than smoothly, and Kay has always been excellent at bringing all of those to the attention of everybody who needs to help deal with them, and has really done an exemplary job. It's hard to imagine anyone doing it better. So thank you very much. Congratulations, and we'll see you next time too.
I really appreciate this, and just for 2 seconds, let me just say thank you both to Bob and to Peter, who have been terrific to work with, and to all of you. This was a big challenge for me because I hadn't worked in this area, and frankly, I think as I was beginning to meet people, I recognized maybe 2 faces in the whole crowd. So I was brand new to this group. Gosh, I'm all of a sudden feeling choked up. But I just wanted to thank you for how you embraced me as the new person and not as the identity geek. And yet you took me in and you let me be part of this group. And I really felt that we became a team. We'd never worked together, and yet I think we've worked together incredibly well. And I think one of the most important things about the last year and a half or so is that we just keep talking and we keep communicating and we keep trying. And that would be my encouragement to you. You haven't given up so far, and there were lots of times when I thought maybe we might, frankly, but you didn't. And I'm just so proud of the work that's happened so far, and I just think that we're really starting to turn the corner, and I just know that you're really going to make this happen. And I'm very excited for you, and I'm just, like I said, don't give up. Keep going. You do great things. And part of what intrigued me when I was recruited to come and join you was that what you're trying to accomplish is sort of revolutionary. And I liked being a part of that. And so I do really want to be, around still and hang out with this group some more and become a member because I think this is so important and is sort of world-changing. And I'm just really been thrilled to be a part of it. And thank you for letting me.
Okay, back to work. It's okay. We are now going to begin a lunch break. Do we start the BOFs at 12:45? Is that correct?
That's what we were shooting.
Right. Okay. So we will now take a quick break. There is a cafeteria that direction, and there is also a cafeteria that direction. One of them is across the parking lot. The other is across the street. You may get food, bring it back here. There will be 2 birds of a feather session. The one in this corner over here will be led by Daza Greenwood and will be discussing big data and identity. The one in this corner over here, there'll be a partition in the middle of the room, will be led by aesthetics and will be discussing anonymity and pseudonymity issues. We should begin promptly at 12:45. Our time is somewhat constrained, so please go get lunch, bring it back, and let's participate in the BOFs. Thanks, everyone.